Welcome everyone. I hope you can hear me. We've had one or two technical issues to sort out as we've got online this evening, but hopefully you are with us for this David Goodbourn Annual Lecture. It's actually a postponed lecture from last year for reasons that we will all be familiar with, but we're so glad it's going ahead now. And I want to welcome you on behalf of the Centre for Theology and Justice here based here at Luther King Centre in Manchester. It's a partnership of Luther King Centre with Christian Aid, Churches Together in Britain and Ireland, and Church Action on Poverty. And together we have formed this centre and we hold this lecture each year. My name's Graham Sparks, I'm president of the Luther King Centre, and it's a great joy to welcome you, and in a moment I shall welcome our special guests this evening. For those who don't know, David Goodbourn is a much loved, much respected person amongst us. For all sorts of reasons. I won't say a lot about him because I know our lecturer is going to dialogue with David and his thinking, but David was an innovative theological educator, committed ecumenist, worked extensively here in Manchester and also in Scotland to develop patterns of theological education for the church and new ways of forming those who were preparing for ministry. David worked part of his life for Churches Together in Britain and Ireland. He served the World Council of Churches in all kinds of capacities. And we were privileged to have him here in Manchester for many years. And we continue to rejoice in the links we have with his wife, Lynn, and give God thanks for all his continuing influence amongst us, and this lecture is in his memory. We're delighted that it's being given by Isabel Phiri. Isabel is the Associate General Secretary for the WCC. She's well known and respected as an academic and an ecumenist. She was previously a professor of African Theology in South Africa, Pietermaritzburg. For the World Council of Churches, Isabel's main responsibility is setting the direction for the programme work in the area of public witness and diaconia, as well as strengthening the relationships between member churches. She's part of the very significant circle of concerned African women theologians, and I know can tell us a little bit about that today as she speaks to us. And I certainly bring with me here this evening memories of the inspiring paper you gave, Isabel, at the WCC agenda in Porto Alegre, quite a few years ago now. But that's an experience that lives on in my memory. And this evening, you're going to speak to us about ecumenical leadership and a holistic approach to social justice, drawing on David Goodbourn's work. And too, we're delighted that a colleague of yours, Isabel, who I think shared in writing this lecture this evening, is also with us. Masiwa Gunda. Masiwa, welcome to you. You also work now for the World Council of Churches on its responses to racism. And we're delighted that you can share with us in this evening's event. Isabel's going to speak to us. As she does so, by all means, put comments and questions in the chat. And my two good colleagues, Simon Oxley, Clara Rushbrook, will be gathering those together and will give us a time to engage with questions, answers with Isabel and Masiwa at the end of Isabel's lecture. Isabel, we welcome you. It's a real honor, a real privilege to have you with us. We've waited a long time for this. We're glad you're here. And over to you. We look forward to all that you have to share with us this evening.
Thank you very much, for having me here. I want to first, acknowledge the late David Goodbourn's family, especially his wife, who may be with us today. And then to you, Reverend, Graham Sparks, I'm grateful for the introduction and for the invitation. And I also want to acknowledge, Dr. Clara Brook, the co-principal of Northern Baptist College. I want to acknowledge my Reverend Dr. Simon Oxley, the facilitator who actually sent me the invitation. So I'm so grateful for this invitation. And dear sisters and brothers in the Lord, I appreciate the fact that we are here today. So on behalf of the World Council of Churches, I would like to express our profound gratitude for this invitation to give this lecture in honor of Dr. David Goodbourn. I first met the late Dr. Goodbourn in 2006 at Bose Institute in Switzerland, where we were both serving the WCC Commission on Education and Ecumenical Formation soon after the Porto Alegre WCC 9th Assembly. I was moderator of that commission. This was a particularly difficult commission, which brought together ecumenical theological education, Bose Institute, lay formation and education and library. And Dr. Goodbourn, he came with rich experience in these fields, and he was very valuable to me. I was impressed with his insightful contributions to ecumenical education and formation, as his passion and commitment was very clear. So, introduction. This presentation is an attempt to reflect on the work of David Goodbourn as it responds to issues of social justice and within the framework of the pilgrimage of justice and peace. The choice of the title of this presentation is inspired by three things. First, the inspiration comes from the Reverend Dr. Simon Oxley's obituary for David Goodbourn, where he skillfully made a connection between Goodbourn's year of birth with the year that the World Council was established. Dr. David Goodbourn was born in 1948, and he grew to become a towering figure in ecumenical education. 1948 is a year that 1948 is a year that has many faces for our world today. It was the year that the nations of the world propagated the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was also the year in which the World Council of Churches was formally instituted as a culmination of consultations that had begun a decade earlier, but disrupted by the Second World War. These two siblings of David Goodbourn put human dignity, human equality, and the oneness of humanity at their core. The experiences from the war had made many to realize how an unjust world could spell doom for all people. However, another sibling of Goodbourn was being established in Southern Africa, in particular in South Africa. The Republic of South Africa held elections in 1948, and the National Party, led by Dr. B.E. Malan, who was also a Dutch Reformed minister declared apartheid as its official policy. Whereas the UDHR and the WCC were advocating the unity of all human beings, the South African apartheid government was dividing people into imaginary races that had to be kept apart from each other at whatever cost. It was no coincidence that the WCC, at the time of its formation, immediately recognized the race issue as one of the greatest threats to the unity, both of humankind and the churches, and thus to the ecumenical movement itself. David Goodbourn grew up to directly and indirectly interface with his siblings from 1948 and to provide critical leadership for the achievement of the common good as opposed to promoting the divisive ideals of racist apartheid. The second inspiration comes from Goodbourn's article entitled Holistic Education, Signposts and Warnings. We use what he wrote about holistic education to connect with ecumenical leadership and a holistic approach to social justice within the framework of the pilgrimage of justice and peace themes. Therefore, we have chosen to enter into conversation with David Goodbourn while on a pilgrimage of justice and peace, weaving together the issues of ecumenical leadership and a holistic approach to social justice. In this lecture, allow me to focus on the importance of ecumenical leadership and holistic approaches to social justice, especially as it impacts on our quest to overcome racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia. Although David Goodbourn did not address the question of racism per se, a reflection based on lenses of racism is crucial as the World Council of Churches continues on a pilgrimage of justice and peace from the 10th Assembly in 2013 to the 11th Assembly, which is going to be held in Germany in 2022. In his role as an educator and as an adult educator, David Goodbourn allows us to see why leadership matters in what we do. In making our point, we will focus on why 1948 was a year that demanded leadership and how two responses of leadership that emerged at that point influenced the work and life of David Goodbourn. We will then proceed to highlight why leadership is and must be understood as a service to God. Further, considering how education was central to the life and work of Goodbourn, we want to draw your attention to holistic education as leadership. David Goodbourn explains holistic education as follows, and I'm quoting from his work. For me, holistic education is education that takes seriously all dimensions of human life, including the undergirding faith dimensions, and handles them in a way that engages with intellect, emotion, and creativity and relationship. It sees the individual as part of the community and the educator as facilitator and fellow learner rather than teacher, end of quote. When education is understood as David Goodbourn understood it, then education becomes a leader in that it becomes a positive influencer in our lives, but also becomes leadership in that it equips us to become influencers as well in our circles. The third inspiration comes from the invitation of the WCC 10th Assembly to all WCC member churches, other churches, ecumenical partners, and people of other faiths and people of goodwill to join the pilgrimage of justice and peace. The pilgrimage was also chosen as the theme to guide the Council's efforts to foster greater unity among Christians and to respond within the context of today's religiosity and considering the plural world to the challenges facing the human family in our time. The invitation says, and I quote, "Challenged by our experiences in Busan, we call all people, young and old, women and men, differently abled, people of different faiths, to engage their God-given gifts in transforming actions together. We call first of all on the member churches and partners to work together in a common quest, renewing our vocation of the church through collaborative engagement with the most important issues of justice and peace. Healing a world filled with conflict, injustice, and pain. Participating in God's gift of unity and God's mission of justice and peace, we intend to respond to God's will for this world by becoming communities of justice and peace and celebrating the fellowship of such communities. As an 8-year program emphasis, the Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace combines community-based initiatives and national and international advocacy for just peace, focusing on life-affirming economies, climate change, nonviolent peace building, and reconciliation, and most of all, human dignity, with ongoing analysis, study, reflection on what it means to be on a pilgrimage of justice and peace for the churches in today's world. Now, 8 years have passed by, and we are beginning to harvest, from the work of working, praying, and walking together on the pilgrimage of justice and peace. We are now reflecting on the lived realities of communities which were visited all over the world during these 8 years. And we see new topics which have emerged from these lived realities. And these topics are intersectional. And these are truth and trauma, land and displacement, gender justice, and racial justice. The theme for the Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace in 2021 is racism and indigenous peoples. And that means, every year we have a theme for the Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace. And then for 2022, the theme is the same with that of the WCC 11th Assembly, which is Christ's love moves the world to reconciliation and unity. Therefore, as we reflect on the ecumenical leadership and a holistic approach to social justice, learning from the educator-ecumenist David Goodbourn, we do so within this framework of the Pilgrimage of Justice and Peace with a focus on racism, but also bearing the theme of the 11th Assembly in mind. 1948 and the thirst for leadership. Leadership matters. In lay people's assessments of democracy, we often hear that a community's leadership is as good as those that put it in place, that every community gets the leadership it deserves, or that a community's leadership mirrors the deepest fears, aspirations, and dreams of the community members. In this kind of discussions, the role and function of leaders or leadership is presented as minimal. We want to suggest that there is more value in inventing this lay person's assessment and propose that a community's reality is as good as its leaders or leadership, that communities do mirror their leaders more than leaders mirroring their communities. Leaders are influencers. They are directors and facilitators. They are drivers. Communities listen and follow leaders, and in many cases, this has been to the detriment of communities. Why is this important in the context of 1948? Now, according to the first director of the WCC's program to combat racism, Bodman Solema, I'm quoting, in retrospect, it seems extraordinary that in one and the same year, 1948, 3 major developments took place. First, the UN Human Rights Charter was signed. And second, in South Africa, in a traumatic experience for Black people, the Nationalist Party, led by D.E. Malan, came to power and instituted policy of apartheid. And third, 1948 was also the year of the formal creation of the World Council of Churches, which became the major expression of the ecumenical movement in the 20th century. These 3 developments are interrelated in that they all speak to the need for leadership in the world, to the impact of leadership in communities. First, the experience of the Second World War testified to the destructive nature of some forms of leadership that people from around the world, sadly excluding people of African descent, came together to rethink leadership in the world. The UN Human Rights Charter speaks to this thirst for leadership, leadership that would uphold justice and the equality of all human beings. The unity of humankind was at the heart of this charter. Even as many were realizing the need for human unity, South Africa was displaying a different kind of leadership. It was setting itself up to be a divided community as it put into power a leadership that was promoting the inequality of humankind, committing itself to forcefully enforce the separation of peoples because of physical differences through its official apartheid policy. Finally, the WCC came to life proclaiming the equality of all human beings, because every human being is an image of God, and because Christ's death has opened up the path to salvation for all peoples, notwithstanding their differences. What differences people had were insignificant compared to what similarities they possessed. The Eucharist invited Christians to look beyond their differences and brought them together to belong to one humanity. Sharing a meal makes us one family. In 1948, the world was awake to destructive leadership and in search of constructive leadership. And in the UN and the WCC, the world was being shown a kind of leadership that had the potential and never fully realized to deliver justice if it could succeed in providing a model for the world. The war period had shown the destructive nature of the great man type of leadership. Great man because of the lack of mention of female leadership. The system of leadership that placed all power and authority in a single man was part of the reason why the world had been plunged into war, in which injustice, discrimination, and hatred were the major victors, and communities were the greatest losers. What happened in the aftermath of the war was a crossroads. There were those that saw what had happened as wrong, and others who saw no fault with the divisions that led to the war. On the one hand, many states chose to pursue an alternative path and model of leadership as a unique of the great man type of leadership. It questioned the idea that leaders were born and not made, and proposed that leadership could be taught and leaders made. The UN Charter could be interpreted as the curricula of an alternative leadership that could lead the world to being reconciled in justice, peace, respect, and thereby upholding the dignity of all persons. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights sought to affirm the equality of all persons as opposed to the period before that, which spurred the hierarchy of persons. On the other hand, what was happening in South Africa was an adaptation of the great man leadership model, in that even though it did not really depend on one strong man, it nonetheless was promoting division of people. The aim of the apartheid system was to divide, to break up, to separate, and to split apart Blacks and whites. It promoted the hierarchies of persons in which white settler South Africans saw themselves as above everyone else. Using the Bible, some South African white theologians, especially from the Dutch Reformed churches, theologized apartheid, seeing division as intended by God. The formal launch of the WCC meant churches had to reflect on these two diametrically opposed paths. A not so easy choice, because one was evidently secular, while the other claimed to be biblical and Christian. The secular path sought to promote the equality of all persons in dignity and worth, whilst the biblical and Christian path sought to justify and rationalize the inequality of persons in dignity and worth. The founding documents and pronouncements of the WCC in 1948 upheld the essence of the UN Charter while rejecting the supposed divine ordination of apartheid. The WCC proclaimed the essential equality of all persons and called the world to be reconciled in justice, love, respect, and thereby upholding the dignity of all persons. Racism, according to the churches, could not be reconciled with the essence of the Christian faith, leading the former General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, the Reverend Dr. Olaf Tvedt, to write, I quote, "The World Council of Churches has a long history of playing a prominent role in protesting against the social injustice. Racism and sexism are just two of the many social injustices that the World Council of Churches struggled against since its formation in 1948. End of quote. 1948 became a watershed year in the development of human relations, and proponents of the two separate paths had to employ education to achieve their goals. The apartheid ideology was taught and observed to entrench it among both its beneficiaries and victims. Everyone had to know their place, accept their station, and defend it. For the WCC, the idea was to promote holistic education that empowers the powerless into active and conscious citizens, even as this type of education was always on the margins in the churches, because church politics thrives or was thriving on having a disempowered base. 4, when leadership is a manifestation of service to God. Even in organizations that are run through multiple sections or departments, leadership must transcend the sections or the departments to have an overall view of the institution. Leadership must be godlike in its capacity to see the bigger picture, understanding the linkages between the sections. One of the strongest points of the great man leadership style was its ability to compartmentalize the different sections and only have the leader know them without the sections knowing each other. In the history of the church, leadership has failed to have a godlike capacity when it comes to addressing questions of justice. Relevant leadership is obliged to avoid unnecessary division of justice. For example, a common approach or mistake has been to resist racism or sexism separately, and often champions of one are blind to the injustices of the other. When this happens, it is an indictment of leadership, because when leadership is seen as service to God, it will promote justice and respect for all at all times. Leadership is not and can never be an end in itself. Leadership must be understood as a means to serving God, and serving God means protecting and defending the people of God from the things that offend God, such as oppression, exploitation, racism, inequality, and inequality. Whereas education has been used as a means to gaining, entrenching, and sustaining a hold on to power, leadership in service to God promotes education as a means to empower God's people to appreciate their own worth, as well as accepting and respecting the worth of their neighbor. The primary motive for this leadership is not to acquire resources for itself, but to equip the people of God with the capacity to thrive and experience the abundant life promised by Christ. This leadership sees not the surface differences between people, but the deep essential similarities that unite all people at the feet of the Creator and beneath the cross of salvation. In the preceding section, we observed how two different models of leadership emerged in the aftermath of the Second World War. And while both were not perfect, we have safely concluded that the South African model betrays a leadership model that was driven by the desire and an inherent tendency to capture resources and use them for self-maintenance. It sought to equip people in order to strengthen itself against the same people. It promoted its own interest and not the divine will, nor the common good of the people of South Africa. When leadership is first and foremost service to God, serving to promote and protect the divine will, it will promote knowledge of the divine truth, such as, I quote, "We have learned that race is not a biological or a scientific category per se. The idea that humanity is divided into significantly different races has no scientific evidence. Race is rather a social construction, indeed a modern one, serving some interest of somebody. But racism as an ideology rooted in this construction is a global political, social, and economic phenomenon, indeed a moral and spiritual problem, because it is sophisticated and brutal reality." End of quote. As such, racism cannot coexist with the Christian faith, whose essence is the reconciliation of all peoples of the earth through the power of the cross, the resurrection, and Eucharist. So what can we appropriate from the rich legacy of David Goodbourn? Now I turn to education for leadership in social justice. Clearly, driving the world towards racial justice and social justice in general will depend on the way we are going to use education. The principles of social justice, including equality, equity, equal opportunities, respect, and love, are elements that can and must be taught as part of a holistic approach to human development. David Goodbourn saw the power of equipping ministers with the right kind of education to allow them to provide relevant leadership to their communities. And David played a leading role in expanding education and reconciling the academy and the community. Under his leadership, I'm quoting, "The resources of the college were made available to people in the churches through open courses, events, and Saturday conferences in Manchester and across the region. His concern was for a theology of the people done by the people." End of quote. In bringing the academy closer to the people and the people closer to the academy, David Goodbourn was blurring the separation of leaders and followers. A theology of the people done by the people is likely to appreciate the life experiences of the people and to address their experiences than a theology of the people done by the academy outside the community. Leadership provides the platform to magnify the people, not their leaders. When it comes to social justice, we can identify 3 different ways in which churches and Christians have evaluated the necessity or goal for education. In the first instance, there are churches that have thrived on a rigid dualism to religious and non-religious spheres of life on earth. For this group, especially among the laity, the focus is on individual education and the goal is to get to heaven. In the second instance, there are churches that seemed to have been influenced by theories of religious affective capacity, which allowed religious elements to cloud people's capacity to oppose bad leadership in this world. For this group, education was only relevant if it focused on equipping communities, because community consciousness and raising awareness was considered for keeping the world on the path of justice. In the third and final instance, there are churches that embrace a religion that penetrates all spheres of life and an education that equips them to function effectively in this world. However, critical investigation and exposition for this group is reserved for aspects considered this worldly, while religion is insulated against critique. These differences clearly shows the need for holistic education, which equips people to pursue social justice in all spheres of life. Holistic education cannot be education that explores everything except its own foundations. Holistic education is a systematic, values-based approach to solving community problems without allowing some spheres of life to escape its attention. Holistic education is value-based and contextual, with a clear aim of solving the problems or fulfilling felt needs or aspirations of the community. Whatever education we can think of, ministerial formation, ecumenical theology, by extension for laity, professional training in humanities and natural sciences, the essence of holistic education needs to prioritize, because every person is exposed to the importance of community and the individual as a member of the community. The values of equality, dignity, respect that emanate from the image of God in all persons and even in the entirety of God's creation need to be instilled in all forms of education. Holistic education can reclaim the role of education for human development prior to professional development. Social justice is not a concern for humanities only. It is the goal of holistic education. So, lessons on ecumenical education for overcoming racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia. The reality of our time is that racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia are alive. These sad and sinful realities have been strengthened by a pluralist, a popularist, nationalist political movement, especially in the global north. This far right politics has embodied persons who harbor racist attitudes and behaviors. Globalization has, among other things, forced or facilitated massive migrations, especially by people from the global south trekking to the north in search of greener pastures. Large numbers of migrants and diverse peoples in European, North America, and Chinese spaces has created an excuse for far-right political entities to use migrants as scapegoats for the struggling of ordinary citizens in these spaces. Laws have been put in place in the past and present that discriminate against migrants and persons considered different from those that consider themselves to be the authentic nationals. This legalization of discrimination is behind systemic racism and xenophobia in many countries today. Other than systematic racism and xenophobia, these sins have also always been personal sins, in that there are many people either believing the propaganda of the far-right populist nationalist parties that accuse migrants and foreigners of eating the cake meant for the ordinary nationals, or that support these far-right political parties because they see them as the outlets of their deepest fears and hopes. This problem is deeply entrenched in our societies. How can ecumenical education help in addressing these serious problems? The success of discriminatory systems, both at structural and personal levels, have greatly been aided by the promotion of specialized and compartmentalized education that has focused more on producing professionals at the expense of developing human beings. According to Goodbourn, this culture has tried to drive apart the essential elements that are needed to develop total persons, and the educator must therefore put maximum energy into keeping together. The elements that need to be reconciled in order not only to overcome racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia, but all forms of discrimination and marginalization are, and now I'm quoting from Goodbourn. He mentioned the first one is faith and life. He said, there are strong pressures in culture to compartmentalize these so that faith becomes a private matter and life is lived according to its own rules. Holistic education will want to insist that faith informs life and life shapes faith. The two are essentially dialectical relationship. Educators must resist any pressure to explore life issues without theological reflection or religion without engagement with life issues. The two must always be talking with one another, end of quote. In essence, Christian faith, or any other faith for that matter, must dialogue with the lived experiences of the believers. It must shape life. Our conduct must be informed by our faith, and this should become an essential element of our education, irrespective of our profession. It is the culture of separating faith and life that has made an ethical leadership and an ethical professional conduct appear like a hallmark of excellence in our times. In this regard, Leadership is critical because it creates the platform for educators and learners to be able to think critically and act responsibly, as is the ultimate goal for all people, no matter what their desired vocation. The second is individual and community. And again, I'm quoting from Goodbourn. The West, that's post-Enlightenment mindset, often finds it difficult to understand the community dimension of education, seeing it as essentially an individual activity. Holistic education has to hold the line, refusing to extract people from their context in order to educate them, and insisting that education is undertaken in context and in partnership with the community that inhabits that context, end of quote. The emphasis on individual qualifications gained through individual examinations have tended to undermine the importance of communal education. This dimension is particularly clear in former colonies, where colonial education sought to create fractures in colonized communities and was divorced from the lived experiences or felt needs of the communities in favor of global education, which was ill-equipped to address the problems and challenges of these communities. Holistic ecumenical education must revisit the dichotomy of the individual versus the community and insist on contextually relevant education. The racism and xenophobia pandemic, which has been with us for centuries, has not only infected our societies, it has infected our churches and the ecumenical movement. While churches seek to transform the society into racially just and xenophobia-free societies, as David Goodbourn would have argued, churches and the ecumenical movement must always strive to transform themselves into anti-racist and anti-xenophobia spaces that equip their members through holistic education with the skills not only to critique society, but to critique the churches themselves. In conclusion, I want to quote again the former General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, Reverend Dr. Olaf Tved. When he was paying tribute to David, he said, I quote, "We in the World Council of Churches are especially grateful for his contributions to the work of the WCC Commission on Education and Ecumenical Formation, the WCC Program Committee, and for his transformative participation in all three governing bodies of the World Council of Churches, the Assembly, the Central Committee, and the Executive Committee. The pandemic of racism and xenophobia is real and deeply entrenched into mindsets. The only way of undoing what has been done by the racist and xenophobic structures and systems of this world through compartmentalized education is to intensify holistic education, which promotes the development of a critically conscious mass of believers who realize their faith must give direction to their life. Individuals and communities that accept that racism and xenophobia are sins that ought to be overcome through theological education and scientific study. As we prepare to go to the World Council of Churches 11th Assembly under the theme Christ's Love Moves the World to Reconciliation and Unity. We are reading the signs of our times as we are reflecting on how the ecumenical movement can work together to overcome racism. The priority themes of the 11th Assembly also includes, COVID-19, climate justice, the fourth industrial revolution, peace building, and many more. I thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. You have given us a huge amount of material to go away and ponder and think over. Can I invite everyone to put your comments and your questions into the chat, and that way we can begin to have a dialogue. Yeah, I agree. Someone's just said, delighted it's being recorded, because I think for many of us to go away and revisit, there were so many themes there to cover. But whilst you're putting your own questions into the chat, if I may, Isabel, just begin. One of the things that really stood out for me was you talking about the need for leadership to be godlike and must transcend, be godlike and see the bigger picture. And I'm very mindful that as we gather this evening, we have politicians from around the world, we have environmental campaigners, protesters, all gathering not far from us up the road in Glasgow. And I just wondered what your view of, there's been lots of comments in the media about this is the time for world leaders to step up. We've heard that from Greta Thunberg, we've heard that from David Attenborough. What would be your kind of take on that? How would you see world leaders being able to step up and see that bigger picture?
Yeah, I guess the problem is that with world leaders, they're not concerned about what are the issues or the signs of our times that need to be addressed, but they are also concerned about their own continuation in politics, right? So those who pay them, who influence their ideas, are the ones, that are eventually controlling the final decision that will be made. And unfortunately, money matters when it comes to these kind of issues, where, those people with lots of money and they promise governments, that if you vote in this particular way, we will give you, this money. So then the leaders are not listening to the people, or they are not looking at the bigger picture, that goes beyond their own existence in politics. That, they need to safeguard the earth for their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren. But they're just being narrow-minded, thinking about their political career, and make sure that they are still voted in power. But I guess if we truly believe in community, right, can vote leaders out if the leaders are not fulfilling, the healing of the earth or making decisions that are for life. So I believe in the power of the community to use our vote to make, decisions that will protect the earth. So I'm hoping that, the leaders there, as they make decisions, they are not only listening to the people who are promising them money, but they are also listening to the grassroots who are going to vote for them next time around.
Thank you, Isabel. Siwa, could I bring you in here? Would you also like to comment and join the conversation? Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Good to have you with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Prof, for the lecture. I really enjoyed myself following you and raising these issues. But the question that you're raising about world leaders and COP26 in Glasgow is very interesting in the sense that at the heart of this gathering is an attempt to find solutions to climate justice. But I was reading an article, or I just browsed an article just before we started this webinar, which said that, you know, the number of jets that have been flown into Glasgow dumped around 13,000 tons of carbon dioxide, which is much more than what Scots will have, you know, throughout the year. And this for me, like Isabel was saying, is really a contradiction. Can't our leaders find other ways of saying that they are in support of climate justice, you know, rather than actually worsening the situation to go to a meeting where they intend to say, we have to do something about climate justice? I guess what leadership needs now or demands now are actually actions that promote climate justice rather than words that are simply words from our leaders, because that's all we have been getting for the past decade. Leaders meet, leaders say things, but leaders do exactly the opposite of what is needed to be done. And like Prof is saying, I think money is deciding the fate of this world, and money is not taking us on the right path.
Thank you. We've got a couple of comments coming in here. Rosalind has pointed out that most of the activists have arrived by train or indeed by foot. A number of pilgrimages have converged on Glasgow. Right, so thank you very much, Isabel, for such a challenging lecture. In our moving forward, if you are proposing an anti-xenophobic theology, what is the scope and content for a decolonial ecumenical public theology for the 21st century? In other words, how do we nurture decolonial models of ecumenical leaderships? Sorry, I'm struggling to read. Text is very small.
Masiwa, do you want to take that one?
Sorry, can you come again on the question?
So the question is around proposing an anti-xenophobic theology. What might be the scope and content for that decolonized ecumenical public theology for this 21st century? How do we nurture those models of ecumenical leadership?
Thank you. What I would say is that I think at the heart of xenophobia is an understanding of the other or the stranger or the foreigner as separate, and separate not only because of the surface differences that could be skin color, that could be language, that could be cultural heritage, but rather xenophobia tends to place an essential difference between people, in that the outsider, the stranger, is essentially different from those of us that considers ourselves as the locals, as the right people for this specific geographical space. And what an anti-xenophobia theology would try to do is to go back to the very basics. I think sometimes we struggle a lot with trying to articulate the essential similarities of all human beings. But I think if we go back to the basics, and I come in as a Bible scholar, an Old Testament scholar, but also a little bit with the New Testament. But if we go back to the very basics, the creation, the cross, in those fundamental pillars of the Christian faith, we realize that the stranger is not essentially different from us. The differences are surface differences that do not define what it means to be human. The danger with what is happening in our world today is that, and we have to accept this, whether in the global north or in the global south, the ordinary people always get the short end of the stick. And so whether our national economies are doing very well, we still have homeless people in Europe. We still have street people in the United States, which clearly shows that our system, while it appears to be very healthy because of the GDP and all these other statistics that we report on, in reality, our systems are not perfect. The ordinary people are suffering, even as the economies are thriving. So how do we solve this problem? We see political systems that divert attention from the structural problems that are causing homelessness and all the levels of poverty that we see in the developed countries, and blame the stranger, blame the outsider or the migrant. So the ordinary people is the one that's pitted against the migrant. The ordinary people can no longer see the structural sources of their poverty, of their problems. They now see the stranger as their problem. And so I'm looking at a situation where we develop a theology that can make the ordinary person realize that the enemy here is not the migrant. It is the structures that have allowed homelessness to become an acceptable way of life in an economy that is actually thriving. So where are the dividends going? So I think this is where we come in, where we want churches to go beyond the pulpit and the sermon that takes people to heaven by making real what we say in the Lord's Prayer, that God's will be done in heaven as it is on earth. If that is done, then we should be able to eliminate these kinds of problems, because the far-right political wing that continues to campaign on these issues that lead to xenophobia, they are capitalizing on the existence, on the reality that there are poor people in developed countries. But they don't want to focus on why there are poor people in the developed countries. Instead, they tell poor people that your bread is being eaten by the migrant, by the foreigner. And this is not only happening in Europe. In South Africa, you might have followed over the years cases of xenophobic attacks against other Africans. And so this, for me, is actually an indictment or a failure of the current system that is running this world.
I also wanted to say that, this is not a problem of the global north only. It's also a problem in the global south. And I'm speaking from South Africa, and it's there. The xenophobia is here, just as it is in my home country, Malawi, right? So this is a global problem that, we really need to deal with together. And focusing on the issues that were preached about in the churches all over the world, over this weekend, there was the issue of loving God and loving your neighbor as you love yourself, right? That, if that's what we concentrate on, it would help us, handle all these issues of xenophobia and racism that we're talking about. It is a theology of love. And I see there's a question in the chat that I should talk about my own experiences of good leadership. how do they shape and influence those around me? When I look at my own development, I have developed where I am, not because I was mentored by women, I was mentored by men, okay? Men who did not feel threatened by mentoring a woman to a leadership position, right? They created the space for me to thrive, right? And both in my education and also at work. I found myself in the context where most of the people that I'm working with are men, and mostly, men from the global north. And the space has been created for me. But at the same time, I've also questioned, where I could see that, statements are being made which are sexist and racist by good people, right? I'm not talking about, people who are openly or like, what we've been talking about right wing, but I'm not talking about the right wing kind of people. I'm talking about good Christians who have good intentions, but they don't realize that there is racism in some sentences that are said or actions done simply because of the way they themselves have been brought up. Because it's in the system, like issues of privilege, one is not aware that you have certain privileges because of your skin color, right? And that the others don't have the same simply because of their skin color again. So those kind of things we need to be aware of. And I believe education to help us to be aware of these intricates, would be very important. Awareness of, when we are being sexist, awareness when we are being racist. And then as I work with other women, especially through the circle of concerned African women theologians, we realize that we need education to be able to articulate our own experiences, articulate them and analyze them theologically using the tools that we have, within African theology, biblical scholarship, or whether it's systematic theology or practical theology. So we need to be deliberate about mentoring others to be able to write and tell their stories, so that the stories of African women should be written by African women themselves, because experience is key, as we develop ourselves, theologically.
Thank you, Isabel. Do we have any more questions? Anything else coming up in the chat?
Yes, can I ask a question?
Go on, Simon.
Isabel, you talk about the way women theologians have, in the circle, have been able to articulate their own experience theologically. How far is that constrained by the fact that the theological tools that you've been given have very often originated in the North, in the West, and how far have you been able to develop your own theological tools that are consonant with your own experience and your own culture, and not use tools that have been developed by another culture and in a sense imposed on you as the only right way of doing it?
One thing that we need to admit is that formal education came to us, through the missionaries. It came through the global north to the global south, right? So our thinking has been shaped by that theology, right? But then as you begin to reflect on those issues, for yourself, you begin to ask questions, questions like, who am I as an African Christian? Because I've chosen to remain Christian, right? So who am I as an African Christian, but at the same time as a woman who experienced God differently from the male African Christians, right? So by asking those questions, then I'm beginning to develop a different kind of theology, that I have received tools which have equipped me to ask questions which are not normally asked in the global north. We're raising our own questions and thereby finding our own answers that respond to the questions we are asking. Because as we learn theology, the formal theology that is designed, in the global north with books written, by scholars, not that they are bad, they are good books. It's just that they don't prepare us to be Christians in our context. That, how do I deal with the African world view, which is not covered in the Western theology, because, rational explanation of things is not the same with, rational explanation of things, where we come from. So we need to ask our own questions, and we do, except that, we need to go beyond the academy to become, to be part of the community where these things are happening. I remember when I joined the World Council of Churches, I was told that, they are looking for theologians and not activists. And then it bothered me because I don't know how to be a theologian and an activist, because my context demands that I put these things in tension, that for me to be a theologian also means, going out to match with people, to be an activist, because things are not given to you on the silver plate. You have to fight for them. So that's what is new then in our context, that it requires of us to be theologians and activists at the same time. You don't have to choose one or the other.
Thank you. Can I just ask a follow-up on that? So how can your experience help those of us who are captives of systems that we've created, and perhaps prevent us from actually really developing our own ways of being and doing, we're prisoners of the systems we've created?
Yeah, well, I would say that, the most important thing is to be open-minded, to be willing to listen to the other, right? Knowing that the theology developed in the global north is contextual theology for the north, right? And that for those of us who are coming from the global south, our theology must not be judged, by the same yardstick, because our context is different. So if the theological institutions in the global north are open to this understanding that their theology is contextual, and that they should be willing to explore other contextual theologies that are coming from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, and that they are, because they come from these areas, they are not inferior theologies. They speak the language of God as experienced in those contexts. So it's about knowing the other. We grew up with a curriculum because we were colonized by the British. So we during my time, our education system required us to memorize the rivers of the UK, you know, with your train stations, your mountains, but it did not address our mountains. It did not prepare us to know our rivers and our lakes, right? So the most important thing then is to decolonize our curriculum, which they have done now, but we need more of it so that even in universities, priority should be given to books that are written by people from that particular context so that we understand ourselves before we go out to understand the world. Because I believe it is important to understand the whole world. We need to understand it, but we need to know ourselves first. Yeah.
Can I just pick up, Isabel? You talked in particular about the circle, and actually I think one of the hugely significant things about the circle is it is a circle, it is a collective. It is not an attempt of theologians and activists to go it alone. And I think that's something that the West desperately needs to learn, is how we can do theology in dialogue and through listening with to one another and bringing our own experiences, but being open to listen to the experiences of others. I think that is absolutely key.
Yeah, that it's true, because, you know, the circle is doing theology in community. And the good thing is we have, you know, the larger Pan-African circle, and then we have chapters, right? So that you are doing your theology that is not just African, but it's particular. You are creating the theology that comes from your particular context and feeding into the bigger picture. I found it very empowering, you know, to know that you are not theologizing alone, theologizing with others. And the others are not just in the academic, but the others are also in the church. So we need that practical side, you know, that comes from the church, from the lived experience of the people, to be part of this circle of concerned African women theologians, that it's not just the academics, but also the ordinary people. And it's intersectional as well, that, you know, our theology must receive, you know, from other disciplines, right? That don't just meet as theologians, but, you know, open up to other disciplines so that your theology is enriched, you know, by the experiences, you know, coming from other areas. So disciplinary studies are very important.
Which very much takes us back to the work of David Goodbourn and his emphasis on community. Something I think we still need to hear. And we need to hear today. Yeah.
He spoke a language which we understand in the Global South, because he describes what we are doing there. Yeah. So maybe he was ahead of his time in the context of, you know, the UK.
Maybe he was. I think we need to hand back to Graham, because I'm just keeping an eye on the time.
Thank you, Clara. Our time has beaten us. We want to say a very big thank you to you, Isabel, also to Masiwa, for joining us and being with us this evening. Thank you so much. Thank you for blessing us with your wisdom and understanding, blessing us with your experiences and your insights, blessing us simply with your presence amongst us. We are deeply grateful to you both for joining us, being with us, giving this very special lecture on this special occasion in memory of David. Thank you so much. Thank you too for all who've joined us. Thank you for being part of this community this evening, as we have shared together and learned together and been enriched by Isabel and all that she has shared with us. May God's grace and God's love go with us all. We pray for you, Isabel, for you, Masiwa, for your work for the WCC, for the World Council of Churches, particularly as you prepare for the assembly next year in Germany. Pray that God will richly bless you as you prepare and continue the work that you're doing in all sorts of ways amongst the member churches of the WCC. Thank you, and thanks to all who've joined us. We're grateful to you for being with us. It has been recorded, I think, and we will make sure that recording is made available to those who've been part of this evening together. Thank you. Go well. God bless.